One of my favorite classes in college and in seminary had to do with learning to read, interpret, appreciate biblical poetry. About a third of the Old Testament is written in poetry. And so understanding a little bit about how Israelite poetry works can help us learn to really appreciate what is written for us in that way. So we are talking in our history class about the United Kingdom stage, and this is the high point of the literary output of Israel as well. We'll have great writers that will come later, like in Isaiah, incredible writer of the servant songs, the prophets as they write down what God tells them, and even psalms being written during captivity. But the United Kingdom is that time when the writings of Israel really seem to blossom. David is the sweet psalmist of Israel, and so many of the psalms begin by saying a psalm of David. David also arranges for the worship in the temple. So the temple is not even built yet, and he's planning, here are the choir members, here are the songs, here's the hymnal that will be sung when worship happens in the temple. And so that's David putting together those ideas. And then we have Solomon in his wisdom coming along, writing those Proverbs, beginning the collection. You'll notice when you read the book of Proverbs that there's a section written, collected by Hezekiah's men. There's a later section that is written and collected from, among other things, some Egyptian works. And then you have at the end the words of King Lemuel that are written out. So the collections continue, but the genesis of them and a good part of them are written right during the United Kingdom stage by David and by Solomon. Solomon also wrote, besides Proverbs, he wrote a longer work called Ecclesiastes that instead of being collections of two-sentence proverbs, it's a longer treatise trying to examine what matters, trying to examine what is good. We have this one life. We only go around once. So what is the way to best invest our lives? And he tries all kinds of things in his description of living under the sun from a secular perspective, and he comes to the conclusion that the only thing that matters is learning to fear God and to live life in relationship with him. So that's your book of Ecclesiastes. And then Solomon's Song of Songs, which in Hebrew, repeating song twice means it's the most excellent song. It's the best he did. He wrote a love song, which is a Song of Solomon, actually a collection of love songs that's constructed in a pretty interesting way, we'll talk about in a minute, that helps us to see how intricate Hebrew poetry would become. So this is the United Kingdom stage. This is the heyday of Israel literature. The Hebrews were masters in poetic expression, not in the sense of rhyme. They didn't rhyme words like we do in English. Our poetry is based sort of on rhyme and those kinds of schemes. But poetry is based on idea and repeating an idea in a similar way, which helps to make the full sense more concrete, help us to give us a better sense of what the poet is trying to say. So they're masters of repetition, and they do it in a couple of different ways. They do it mainly by parallelism. Parallelism means taking, when they write a proverb or a line of poetry, the first line and the second line would be related to each other. The first line, if it says virtually the same thing as the second line, it was called synonymous parallelism. Two lines that were sort of expressing the same idea. Then there was antithetic parallelism. Those two lines would be repeating a similar idea, but this time from a negative point of view. Um, and then sometimes they weren't limited to 2 lines. There'd be 3 or more lines, which would build on each other. Um, by using parallelism, it was an aid to memory. So if you're an oral culture, if you're a listening culture, if you receive most of your knowledge in that way, Hebrew poetry is for you because of the repetition, because of the parallelism. It was easier to understand and to memorize. It was a great aid for memory. And then it was a great aid for fuller expression. So it helps to give a bigger, more creative picture. I think of one proverb in particular that says, um, when a son is wise, I'm trying to remember it for sure. When a son is wise, the father rejoices, but a foolish son is a pain to the mother. And what that's saying is one simple idea that the way a child's character is molded causes the parents joy or grief based on how they act. So it wouldn't be good to have a sermon that said, well, fathers get the successful kids and mothers just recognize the pain of the foolish kids. The parents are both affected. It's that parallelism, repeating the idea in the next line. That helps us in translation, actually, because when we try to translate poetry that's based on rhyme, we've got real problems trying to come up with good words to rhyme and yet sticking close to the meaning of the poetry. But translating Hebrew poetry is easier because the lines are parallel. They repeat each other. It's easier to understand and to translate and stay close to the original meaning rather than going out and trying to find something that rhymes. So that's part of Hebrew poetry then, is repetition by way of parallelism, either repeating the idea again or repeating it in a negative way or building on the ideas of the past to make a fuller expression for the reader. Another way that, and this is also parallelism, but another way that they would um, write poetry was called chiasm. This would bring parallelism into the structure of a larger poem. So what they would do is, let's say that we had 5 lines. Now they might have 10 or 20, or in the case of Song of Solomon is one whole book, which is one huge chiasm. But the idea of chiasm is you take those parallel lines, but you structure them in this kind of, in the way in which I have it notated there, A, B, C, B, A. So if I'm going to write a poem, let's say, on giving thanks, A might be something like, give thanks to the Lord for he is good. And then B might be something like, give thanks for all the creation that he has made. Then C might be something like, God has created all things good. And then we would come back to B. If you remember, the first B talked about the wonderful creation that God has made. So our second B will also have to echo that sentiment. So that second B might be something like, praise God for creation and for his wonderful design. And then A will be back to give thanks to the Lord for he is good. You see? So A is repeated, B is repeated, and in chiasm, C may or may not be repeated. But what we know about chiasm is the main point of the poem will be found at letter C, the center focus. So you can see this would be fun to memorize because you think your way down to the central point and then you think your way back out again. So chiasm comes from the Greek letter X. And you can see I got half an X right on my slide here. And you can imagine the other half on the other side. but see how it moves in and then it moves back out. I bet you could write a poem with chiasm as its central focus. So you would have lines A, the two lines called A would be parallel, the two lines called B would be parallel, and then the one line in the middle would be independent, because that's the one that stands out as unique. So chiasm is an interesting way in which Hebrew parallelism is used creatively to help us in memory and just to really light up and structure the enhanced language of poetry in the Hebrew language. So there we are. That's chiasm. They will also use, there's a few Psalms, most notably, of course, Psalm 119, in which each of the verses will begin with a different letter of the Hebrew alphabet. Now, you can't tell that one so much in your English text, except in Psalm 119, where it'll say Aleph, and then all of the verses that are under Aleph will begin with an Aleph. And then you have Beit, and all of the verses that are under there, or virtually all of them, will begin with the letter Beit. All right, so that's acrostic. You're familiar with that because we do them in English as well. So Hebrew uses acrostic as well. Let's look at some of the genres of Hebrew poetry. Genre means we're categorizing those things that are poetic into different classes. For example, we have the Psalms, and inside of the Psalms, we have different kinds of Psalms. We have individual laments, which is an individual praying that God would intervene, holding on to God in the midst of suffering, and hoping to have that suffering alleviated, that God would step in and resolve his situation. Other Psalms, like Psalm 1, will be wisdom Psalms. They will teach us what is good to do. And in Psalm 1, we have a contrast between the wise person and the foolish person. So in Psalms, we have individual lament. We have wisdom Psalms. There's prophetic Psalms, like Psalm 2 or Psalm 110, picturing the coming Messiah. And I think Psalm 22 as well. Read it and see if you don't think that it is predicting specifically something that could happen later on, I don't know, on a cross. Let me know what you think. So, different kinds of Psalms, whether it's an individual or corporate lament, whether we're crying out to God individually or whether we're crying out to God as a nation, those are the different kinds of Psalms that we have in the book of Psalms, and there are other ones as well. Then we have the book of Proverbs, those two sentence um, pithy sayings that make up the book of Proverbs. What's interesting about wisdom in the book of Proverbs is it's international in flavor. So a proverb works whether you are Jewish or whether you are Chinese or Indonesian or English. It's international in flavor because everybody recognizes the wisdom in what you have written. Um, so Proverbs has um, a description of a way, a description of a road, a path. There is going straight ahead on the path of obedience to God and not turning to the right hand or to the left. It's a great picture of what we ought to do as followers after wisdom. The unique feature of Solomon's wisdom is found in Proverbs 1, I think it's verse 6. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. In other words, um, the central focus of what makes Solomon's wisdom so unique is not just looking at life around here and trying to come up with the rules by which we live life successfully, but recognizing that God is right at the core of everything that we do, and recognizing and revering and honoring and respecting and fearing Him is the central concern, and it is what will make our life turn for blessing. So those are two of the poetic genres in Hebrew poetry. Ecclesiastes, we've already mentioned, is a longer reflection. It is written about the limitations that human achievement doesn't deliver the satisfaction that we think it is. So it's really a treatise on what is good, what matters. Because under the sun, all is in vain. Those are some of the themes that'll come up again and again in the book of Ecclesiastes. And then I mentioned Song of Solomon. It's a celebration of God's design in sex, in marriage. It's also a guide for modesty. We are sometimes more modest than the Bible, and I think that's kind of silly. But it's also a way for understanding and respecting and revering what God has made. Of course, there are some interpretational issues. The church has not always wanted to see what seems, at least in my mind, to be sort of plainly taught in the Song of Solomon. And so they have used all kinds of different interpretational things to show that it's really God and Israel that's pictured there and not a man and a woman. Or it's Christ in the church, or they'll come up with some symbolic thing in order to get away from what I think is the plain meaning of the text. That said, Song of Solomon is one huge chiasm. So there will be stories that are told that repeat themselves. Like there are a couple of conflict stories, like in which the Shulamite has a dream, and she's looking for Solomon, and she's going to look for him, and she can't find him, and she struggles with that. Um, there are a couple of other stories that are parallel, and they're forming a big X, a big uh, key, and the whole book is structured like that. And the one story that is not repeated in the book is sitting right in the middle, which is the wedding night. So I think that's the point of the book of Song of Solomon, is that intimacy, that God has created marriage. He has created it good from the very beginning in the garden. He has created us for each other. And it's just really a beautiful book. And you have to just recognize that this is this is Hebrew poetry. It is God delivering us what I think is a real treasure, and I hope you'll find it that way too. So those are at least some of the poetic genres that we'll run into along the way. So we've talked about parallelism, and we've talked about some of the genres that come in poetry, and I hope that will just be the beginning of your enjoyment of Hebrew poetry. It's the high point of literature for Israel. It comes at the beginning, the United Kingdom period, the power, the influence, the education. This is before Homer. This is before Greek influence. It's before the Roman dramas. Um, so 900, 1000 BC, already these kinds of writings are taking prominence, and you and I are so privileged to have an extant text, full, nothing lost, so that we might study the ways of Israel both in its history and in its poetry. Thanks for hanging out.